おはよう。
ございます。じゃあ来てくれてありがとう。今日は英語の本読み配信、昨日言った通り。ほとんどは英語ですけど、日本語で答えますから、コメントしてね。
ロムウェーブ。
どうもありがとう、すみません。今から本読みます。今日の本は、カズオ・イシグロさんの1日の名残りです。The Remains of the Day by カズオ・イシグロ。読みましょう。The Remains of the Day. I've traveled the world twice over, met the famous saints and sinners, poets and artists, kings and queens, old stars and hopeful beginners. I've been where no one's been before, learned secrets from writers and cooks, all with one library ticket. そうですね、すみやさんの好みの本です。All with one library ticket. With the wonderful world of books, Janice James. The Remains of the Day. In the summer of 1956, Stevens, an aging butler, has embarked on a 6-day motoring trip through the West Country. But his holiday is disturbed by the memories of his past service to the late Lord Darlington, and most of all by the painful recollections of his friendship with the housekeeper, Miss Kenton. For the first time in his life, Stevens is forced to wonder if all his actions were for the best after all. A sad and humorous love story and a witty meditation on the democratic responsibilities of the ordinary man. Prologue, July 1956, Darlington Hall. It seems increasingly likely that I will undertake the expedition that has been preoccupying my imagination for some days. An expedition, I should say, which I will undertake alone, in the comfort of Mr. Faraday's Ford. An expedition which, as I foresee it, will take me through much of the finest countryside of England to the West Country, and may keep me away from Darlington Hall for as much as 5 or 6 days. The idea of such a journey came about, I should point out, from a most kind suggestion put to me by Mr. Faraday himself, one afternoon almost a fortnight ago, when I had been dusting the portraits of the library. In fact, as I recall, I was on the stepladder dusting the portrait of Viscount Weatherby, when my employer had entered carrying a few volumes which he presumably wished returned to the shelves. On seeing my person, he took the opportunity to inform me that he had just that moment finalized plans to return to the United States for a period of 5 weeks between August and September. Having made this announcement, my employer put his volumes down on a table, seated himself on the chaise longue, and stretched out his legs. It was then, gazing up at me, that he said, "You realize, Stevens, I don't expect you to be locked up here in this house all the time I'm away. Why don't you take the car and drive off somewhere for a few days? You look like you could make good use of a break." Coming out of the blue as it did, I did not quite know how to reply to such a suggestion. I recall thanking him for his consideration, but quite probably I said nothing very definite, for my employer went on. "I'm serious, Stevens. I really think you should take a break. I'll foot the bill for the gas. You fellows, you're always locked up in these big houses helping out. How do you ever get to see around this beautiful country of ours?" This was not the first time my employer had raised such a question. Indeed, it seems to be something which genuinely troubles him. On this occasion, in fact, a reply of sorts did occur to me as I stood up there on the ladder. A reply to the effect that those of our profession, although we did not see a great deal of the country in the sense of touring the countryside and visiting picturesque sights, I did actually see more of England than most, placed as we were in houses where the greatest ladies and gentlemen of the land gathered. Of course, I could not have expressed this view to Mr. Faraday without embarking upon what might have seemed a presumptuous speech. I thus contented myself by simply saying, "It has been my privilege to see the best of England over the years, sir, within these very walls." うまいこと言うね。Mr. Faraday did not seem to understand this statement, for he merely went on, "I mean it, Stevens. It's wrong that a man can't get to see around his own country. Take my advice. Get out of the house for a few days." As you might expect, I did not take Mr. Faraday's suggestion at all seriously that afternoon, regarding it as just another instance of an American gentleman's unfamiliarity with what was and what was not commonly done in England. The fact that my attitude to this same suggestion underwent a change over the following days, indeed, that the notion of a trip to the West Country took an ever-increasing hold on my thoughts, is no doubt substantially attributable to, and why should I hide it, the arrival of Miss Kenton's letter, her first in almost 7 years, if one discounts the Christmas cards. But let me make it immediately clear what I mean by this. What I mean to say is that Miss Kenton's letter set off a certain chain of ideas to do with the professional matters here at Darlington Hall, and I would underline that it was a preoccupation with these very same professional matters that led me to consider anew my employer's kindly meant suggestion. But let me explain further. The fact is, over the past few months, I have been responsible for a series of small errors in carrying out my duties. In the carrying out of my duties, I should say that these errors have all been, without exception, quite trivial in themselves. Nevertheless, I think you will understand that no one accustomed to committing such errors. This development was rather that to one not accustomed to committing such errors, this development was rather disturbing, and I did in fact begin to entertain all sorts of alarmist theories as to their cause. As so often occurs in these situations, I had become blind to the obvious, that is, until my pondering over the implications of Miss Kenton's letter finally opened my eyes to the simple truth that these small errors of recent months have derived from nothing more sinister than a faulty staff plan. It is, of course, the responsibility of every butler to devote his utmost care in the devising of a staff plan. Who knows how many quarrels, false accusations, unnecessary dismissals, how many promising careers cut short can be attributed to a butler's slovenliness at the stage of drawing up the staff plan. Indeed, I can say I am in agreement with those who say that the ability to draw up a good staff plan is the cornerstone of any decent butler's skills. I have myself devised many staff plans over the years, and I do not believe I am being unduly boastful if I say that very few ever needed amendment. And if, in the present case, the staff plan is at fault, blame can be laid at no one's door but my own. At the same time, it is only fair to point out that my task in this instance had been of unusually difficult order. What had occurred was this. Once the transactions were over, transactions which had taken this house out of the hands of the Darlington family after 2 centuries, Mr. Faraday let it be known that he would not be taking up immediate residence here, but would spend a further 4 months concluding matters in the United States. In the meantime, however, he was most keen that the staff of his predecessor, a staff of which he had heard high praise, be retained at Darlington Hall. This staff he referred to was, of course, nothing more than the skeleton team of 6, kept on by Lord Darlington's relatives to administer to the house, up to and throughout the transactions. And I regret to report that once the purchase had been completed, there was little I could do for Mr. Faraday to prevent all but Mrs. Clements leaving for other employment. When I wrote to my new employer conveying my regrets at the situation, I received by reply from America instructions to recruit a new staff worthy of a grand old English house. I immediately set about trying to fulfill Mr. Faraday's wishes, but as you know, finding recruits of a satisfactory standard is no easy task nowadays. Although I was pleased to hire Rosemary and Agnes on Mrs. Clement's recommendation, I had got no further by the time I came to have my first business meeting with Mr. Faraday during the short preliminary visit he made to our shores in the spring of last year. It was on that occasion, in the strangely bare study of Darlington Hall, that Mr. Faraday shook my hand for the first time, but then we were hardly strangers to each other. Quite aside from the matter of the staff, my new employer in several other instances had occasion to call upon such qualities as it may be my good fortune to possess, and found them to be, I would venture, dependable. So it was, I assume, that he felt immediately able to talk to me in a businesslike and trusting way, and by the end of our meeting he had left me with the administration of a not inconsiderable sum to meet the costs of a wide range of preparations for his coming residency. In any case, my point is that it was during the course of this interview when I raised the question of the difficulty of recruiting suitable staff in these times that Mr. Faraday, after a moment's reflection, made his request of me that I do my best to draw up a staff plan, some sort of servant's rota, as he put it, by which this house might be run on the present staff of 4, that is to say, Mrs. Clements, the 2 young girls, and myself. This might, he appreciated, mean putting sections of the house under wraps. But would I bring all my experience and expertise to bear to ensure such losses were kept to a minimum? Recalling a time when I had a staff of 17 under me, and knowing how not so long ago a staff of 28 had been employed here at Darlington Hall, the idea of devising a staff plan by which the same house would be run on a staff of 4 seemed, to say the least, daunting. Although I did my best not to, something of my skepticism may have betrayed itself. For Mr. Faraday then added, as though for reassuring, that were it to prove necessary, then an additional member of staff could be hired, but he would be much obliged, he repeated, if he could give it a go with 4. Now naturally, like many of us, I have a reluctance to change too much of the old ways. There is no virtue at all in clinging, as some do, to tradition merely for its own sake. In this age of electricity and modern heating systems, there is no need at all to employ the sorts of numbers necessary even a generation ago. Indeed, it has actually been an idea of mine for some time that retaining of unnecessary numbers simply for tradition's sake, resulting in employees having an unhealthy amount of time on their hands, has been an important factor in the sharp decline in professional standards. Furthermore, Mr. Faraday had made it clear that he planned to hold only very rarely the sort of large social occasions Darlington Hall had seen frequently in the past. I did then go about the task Mr. Faraday had set me with some dedication. I spent many hours working on the staff plan, and at least as many hours again thinking about it as I went about other duties, or as I lay awake after retiring. Whenever I believed I had come up with something, I probed it for every sort of oversight, tested it through from all angles. Finally, I came up with a plan which, while perhaps not exactly as Mr. Faraday had requested, was the best. I felt sure that was humanly possible. Almost all the attractive parts of the house could remain operating. The extensive servants' quarters, including the back corridor, the 2 still rooms and the old laundry. The guest corridor up on the old 2nd floor would be dust sheeted, leaving all the main ground rooms and a generous number of guest rooms. Admittedly, our present team of 4 would manage this program only with reinforcement from some daily workers. My staff plan therefore took in the services of a gardener to visit once a week, twice in the summer, and 2 cleaners each to visit twice a week. The staff plan would furthermore, for each of the 4 resident employees, meant a radical altering of our respective customary duties. The 2 young girls I predicted would not find such changes so difficult to accommodate, but I did all I could to see that Mrs. Clements suffered the least adjustments. To the extent that I undertook for myself a number of duties which you may consider broad-minded of a butler to do. Even now, I would not go so far as to say that it is a bad staff plan. After all, it enables a staff of 4 to cover an unexpected amount of ground. But you will no doubt agree that the very best staff plans are those which give clear margins of error to allow for those days when an employee is ill, or for one reason or another below par. In this particular case, of course, it had been a slightly extraordinary task, but I had nevertheless not been neglectful to incorporate margins wherever possible. I was especially conscious that any resistance there may be on the part of Mrs. Clements or the 2 girls to the taking on the duties beyond their traditional boundaries would be compounded by any notion of their workloads had greatly increased. That their workloads had greatly increased. I had then, over those days of struggling with the staff plan, expended a significant amount of thought to ensuring that Mrs. Clements and the girls, once they had got over their aversion to adopting these most eclectic roles, would find the division of duties stimulating and unburdensome. I fear, however, that my anxiety to win the support of Mrs. Clements and the girls, I did not perhaps assess quite as stringently my own limitations, and although my experience and customary caution in such matters prevented my giving myself more than I could actually carry out, I was perhaps negligent for this question of allowing myself margin. It is not surprising then, if over several months this oversight should reveal itself in these small but telling ways. In the end, I believe the matter to be more complicated than this. I had given myself too much to do. You may be amazed that such an obvious shortcoming to a staff plan should have continued to escape my notice. But then you will agree that such is often the way with matters one has given biting thought to over a period of time. One is not struck by the truth until prompted, quite accidentally, by some external event. It was in this instance, that is to say, my receiving the letter from Miss Kent, containing as it did, along with its long, rather unrevealing passages, an unmistakable nostalgia for Darlington Hall, and I am quite sure of this. Distinct hints of her desire to return here obliged me to see my staff plan afresh. Only then did it strike me that there was indeed a role that a further staff member could critically play here, that it was, in fact, this very shortage that had been at the heart of all my recent troubles. And the more I considered it, the more obvious it became that Miss Kent, with her great affection for this house, with her exemplary professionalism, the port almost impossible to find nowadays, was just the factor needed to enable me to complete a fully satisfactory staff plan for Darlington Hall. Having made such an analysis of the situation, it was not long before I found myself reconsidering Mr. Faraday's kind suggestion of some days ago, for it had occurred to me that the proposed trip in the car could be put to good professional use. That is to say, I could drive to the best country and call on Miss Kent in passing, thus exploring at first hand the substance of her wish to return to employment here at Darlington Hall. I should make clear, reread Miss Kenton's recent letter several times, and there is no possibility I am merely imagining the presence of these hints on her part. For all that, I could not for some days quite bring myself to raise the matter again with Mr. Faraday. There were, in any case, various aspects to the matter I felt I needed to clarify to myself before proceeding further. There was, for instance, the question of cost, for even taking into account my employer's generous offer to foot the bill for the gas. The cost of such a trip might still come to a surprising amount, considering such matters as accommodation, meals, and any small snacks I might partake on my way. Then there was a question of what sorts of costumes were appropriate on such a journey, and whether or not it was worth my while to invest in a set of new clothes. I am in the possession of a number of splendid suits, kindly passed down to me over the years by Lord Darlington himself, and by various guests who have stayed in this house and had reason to be pleased with the standard of service here. Many of these suits are perhaps too formal for the purposes of the proposed trip, or rather old-fashioned these days. But then there's one lounge suit passed on to me in 1931 or 1932 by Sir Edward Blair, practically brand new at the time and almost perfect fit, which might as well be appropriate for evenings in the lounge or dining room of any guest houses where I might lounge. What I do not possess, however, is any suitable traveling clothes. That is to say, clothes in which I might be seen driving the car. Unless I were to don the suit passed on by the young Lord Chalmers during the war, which, despite being clearly too small for me, might be considered ideal in terms of tone. I calculate finally that my savings would be able to meet all the costs I might incur, and in addition might stretch to the purchase of a new costume. I hope you do not think me unduly vain with regard to this last matter. It's just that one never knows when one might be obliged to give out that one is from Darlington Hall, and it is important that one be attired at such times in a manner worthy of one's position. During this time, I also spent many minutes examining the road atlas and perusing also the relevant volumes of Mrs. Jane Simmons, The Wonder of England. If you are not familiar with Mrs. Simmons' books, a series running to 7 volumes, each one concentrating on one region of the British Isles, I heartily recommend them. They were written during the 30s, but much of it would still be up to date. After all, I do not imagine German bombs have altered our countryside so significantly. Mrs. Simmons was, as a matter of fact, a frequent visitor to this house before the war. Indeed, she was among the most popular as far as the staff were concerned, due to the kind appreciation she never shied from showing. It was in those days, then, prompted by my natural admiration for the lady, that I had first taken to perusing her volumes in the library whenever I had an odd moment. Indeed, I recall that shortly after Miss Kenton's departure to Cornwall in 1936, myself never having been to that part of the country, would often glance over through volume 3 of Mrs. Simmons' work, the volume which describes to readers the delights of Devon and Cornwall, complete with photographs, and to my mind even more evocative, a variety of artist sketch of that region. It was thus that I had been able to gain some sense of the sort of place Miss Kenton had gone to live her married life. But this was, as I say, back in the 30s, when, as I understand, Miss Simmons' books were being admired in houses up and down the country. I had not looked through those volumes for many years, till these recent developments led me to get down the shelf the Devon and Cornwall volume once more. Study all over again those marvelous descriptions and illustrations. You can perhaps understand my growing excitement in the notion that I might now actually undertake a motoring trip myself around the same part of the country. It seemed in the end there was little else I could do but actually to raise on the matter again with Mr. Faraday. There was always the possibility, of course, that his suggestion of a fortnight ago may have been a whim of the moment, and he would no longer be approving of the idea, but from my observation of Mr. Faraday over these months, he is not one of those gentlemen prone to that most irritating of traits in an employer, inconsistency. There was no reason to believe he would not be as enthusiastic as before about my proposed motoring trip. Indeed, that he would not repeat his most kind offer to foot the bill for the gas. Nevertheless, I considered most carefully what might be the most opportune occasion to bring the matter up with him. For although I would not for one moment, as I say, suspect Mr. Faraday for inconsistency, it nevertheless made sense not to broach the topic when he was preoccupied or distracted. A refusal in such circumstances may well not reflect my employer's true feelings on the matter, but once having sustained such a dismissal, I could not easily bring it up again. It was clear then that I had to choose my moment wisely. In the end, I decided the most prudent moment in the day would be as I served afternoon tea in the drawing room. Mr. Faraday will usually have just returned from his short walk on the downs at that point. He is rarely engrossed in his reading or writing, as he tends to be in the evenings. In fact, when I bring in the afternoon tea, Mr. Faraday is inclined to close any book or periodical he has been reading, rise and stretch out his arms in front of the windows, as though in anticipation of conversation with me. As it was, I believe my judgment proved quite sound on the question of timing. The fact that things turned out as they did is entirely attributable to an error of judgment in another direction altogether. That is to say, I did not take sufficient account for the fact that at that time of the day, what Mr. Faraday enjoys is a conversation of a light-hearted, humorous sort. Knowing this to be his likely mood when I brought in the tea yesterday afternoon, and being aware of his general propensity to talk with me in a bantering tone at such moments, it would certainly have been wiser not to have mentioned Miss Kent at all. You will perhaps understand that there was a natural tendency on my part in asking what was, after all, a generous favor from my employer, to hint that there was a good professional motive behind my request. Instead, so it was that in indicating any of my reasons for preferring the West Country for my motoring, instead of leaving it mention several of the alluring details as conveyed by Miss Simmons' volume. I made the error of declaring that a former housekeeper of Darlington Hall was resident in that region. ちょっと広告入りますね。少々お待ちください。
テンバーパプにも英語ペラペラってこと。だったらいいんだけど、わら。風さんの声落ち着く。 英語全くわからない。風ちゃんの声いいよね。毎週聞いていれば何となくわかるようになるでしょ。私はあのシーンだな、くらいしかわからないけれど、楽しんでるよ。飲み物持ってくる。サラエフプヨンピョン。
読みに戻りましょう。それじゃあ続きはnarration. I suppose I must have been intending to explain to Mr. Faraday how I would thus be able to explore an option which might prove the ideal solution to our present small problems here in this house. It was only after I had mentioned Miss Kenton that I suddenly realized how entirely inappropriate it would be for me to continue. Not only was I unable to be certain of Miss Kenton's desire to rejoin the staff here, I had not, of course, even discussed the question of additional staff with Mr. Faraday since the first preliminary meeting over a year ago. To have continued for months, allowed my thoughts on the future of Darlington Hall would have been, to say the very least, presumptuous. I suspect then that I paused rather abruptly and looked a little awkward. In any case, Mr. Faraday seized the opportunity to grin broadly at me and say with some deliberation, My, Stevens, a lady friend? And at your age? This was a most embarrassing situation, one in which Lord Darlington would never have placed an employee. Then I do not mean to imply anything derogatory about Mr. Faraday. He is, after all, an American gentleman, and his ways are often very different. There is no question at all that he meant any harm, but you will no doubt appreciate how uncomfortable a situation this was for me. I'd never have figured you for such a ladies' man, Stevens, he went on. Keeps the spirit young, I guess, but then I really don't know it's right for me to be helping you with such dubious designations. Naturally, I felt the temptation to deny immediately and unambiguously such motivations to any employer as my employer was imputing to me, but saw in time that to do so could be to rise to Mr. Faraday's bait, and the situation would only become increasingly embarrassing. I therefore continued to stand there awkwardly, waiting for my employer to give me permission to undertake the motoring trip. Embarrassing as those moments were for me, I would not wish to imply that I in any way blame Mr. Faraday, who is in no sense an unkind person. He was, I am sure, merely enjoying the sort of bantering which, in the United States, no doubt, is a sign of a good, friendly understanding between employer and an employee. Indulge in a kind of affectionate sport. Indeed, to put things into a proper perspective, I should point out that just such bantering on my new employer's part has characterized much of our relationship over these months, though I must confess I remain rather unsure as to how I should respond. In fact, during my first days under Mr. Faraday, I was once or twice quite astounded by some of the things he would say to me. For instance, I once had occasion to ask him if a certain gentleman expected at the house was likely to be accompanied by his wife. God help us if she does come, Mr. Faraday replied. Maybe you could keep her off our hands, Stevens. Maybe you could take her out to one of those stables around Mr. Morgan's farm. Keep her entertained in all that hay. She may be just your type. For a moment or two I had not an idea what my employer was saying. Then I realized he was making some sort of joke and endeavored to smile appropriately, though I suspect some residue of my bewilderment, not to say shock, remained detectable in my expression. Over the following days, however, I came to learn not to be surprised by such remarks from my employer, and would smile in the correct manner whenever I detected the bantering tone in his voice. Nevertheless, I could never be sure exactly what was required of me on these occasions. Perhaps I was expected to laugh heartily, or indeed reciprocate with some remark of my own. This last possibly is one that has given me some concern over these months, and is something about which I still feel undecided, for it may well be that in America it is all part of what is considered good professional service that an employee provide entertaining banter. In fact, I remember Mr. Simpson, the landlord of the Plowman's Arms, once saying that were he an American bartender, he would not be chatting to us in that friendly but ever courteous manner of his, but instead would be assaulting us with true references to our vices and failings, calling us drunks and all manner of such names in his attempt to fulfill the role expected of him by his customers. And I recall also, some years ago, Mr. Rain, who traveled to America as valet to Sir Reginald Mavis, remarking that a taxi driver in New York regularly addressed his fare in a manner which, if repeated in London, would end in some sort of fracas, if not in the fellow being frog-marched to the nearest police station. It is quite possible, then, that my employer fully expects me to respond to his bantering in a like manner, and considers my failure to do so a form of negligence. This is, as I say, a matter which has given me much concern, but I must say this business of bantering is not a duty I feel I can ever discharge with enthusiasm. It is all very well in these changing times to adapt one's work to taking duties not traditionally within one's realm, but bantering is of another dimension altogether. For one thing, how would one know for sure that at any given moment a response of the bantering sort is truly what is expected? One need hardly dwell on the catastrophic possibility of uttering a bantering remark, only to discover it wholly inappropriate. I did, though, on one occasion not long ago, pluck up the courage to attempt the required sort of reply. I was serving Mr. Faraday morning coffee in the breakfast room when he said to me, "I suppose it wasn't you making that crowing noise this morning, Stevens?" My employer was referring, I realized, to a pair of gypsies gathering unwanted iron who had passed by early, making their customary calls. As it happens, I had that same morning been giving thought to the dilemma of whether or not I was expected to reciprocate my employer's banter, and had been seriously worried at how he might be viewing my repeated failure to respond to such openings. I therefore set about thinking of some witty reply, some statement which would still be safely inoffensive in the event of my having misjudged the situation. After a moment or two I said, "More like swallows than crows, I would have said, sir, from the migratory aspect." And I followed this with a suitably modest smile to indicate without ambiguity that I had made a witticism Since I did not wish Mr. Faraday to restrain any spontaneous mirth he felt out of a misplaced respectfulness. Mr. Faraday, however, simply looked up at me and said, "I beg your pardon, Stevens." Only then did it occur to me that, of course, any witticism would not be easily appreciated by someone who was not aware that it was gypsies who had passed by. I could not see then how I might press on with this bantering. In fact, I decided it best to call a halt to the matter and pretend to remember something I had urgently to attend to, excuse myself, leaving my employer looking rather bemused. It was then a most discouraging start to what may in fact be an entirely new sort of duty required of me. So discouraging that I must admit I have not really made further attempts along these lines. But at the same time, I cannot escape the feeling that Mr. Faraday is not satisfied with my responses to his various banterings. Indeed, this increased persistence of late may even be my employer's way of urging me all the more to respond in a like-minded spirit. But that as it may, since the first witticism concerning the gypsies, I have not been able to think of other such witticisms quickly enough. Such difficulties as these tend to be all the more preoccupying nowadays because one does not have the means to discuss and corroborate views with one's fellow professionals in the way once did. Not so long ago, if any such points of ambiguity arose regarding one's view. Konnichiwa, Pippi-san. 今日は本読み配信です。英語の。何か質問。ありがとう。ちゃんと選んでたね。本は、すみやさんの好きな本です。そして、曲は俺の好きな龍が如くのです。よければゆっくりしてね。Not so long ago, if any such poem. ありがとう。Not so long ago, if any such points of ambiguity arose regarding one's duties, one had the comfort of knowing that before long some fellow professional whose opinion one respected would be accompanying their employer to the house, and there would be ample opportunity to discuss the matter. And of course, in Lord Darlington's days, when ladies and gentlemen would often visit for many days on end, it was possible to develop a good understanding with visiting colleagues. Indeed, in those busy days, our servants' hall would often witness a gathering of some of the finest professionals in England, talking late into the night by the warmth of the fire. And let me tell you, if you were to have come into our servants' hall on any of those evenings, you would not have heard mere gossip. More likely, you would have witnessed debates over the great affairs preoccupying our employers upstairs, or else over matters of import reported in the newspapers. And of course, as fellow professionals from all walks of life are wont to do when gathered together, we could be found discussing every aspect of our vocation. Sometimes, naturally, there would be strong disagreements, but more often than not, the atmosphere was dominated by a feeling of mutual respect. Perhaps I will convey a better idea of the tone of those evenings if I say that regular visitors included the likes of Mr. Harry Graham, valet butler to Sir James Chambers, and Mr. John Donalds, valet to Mr. Sidney Dickinson. And there were others less distinguished perhaps, but whose lively presence made any visit memorable. For instance, Mr. Wilkinson, valet butler to Mr. John Campbell, with his well-known repertoire of impersonations of prominent gentlemen. Mr. Davidson from the Easterly House, whose passion in debating a point could at times be as alarming to a stranger as his simple kindness at all at times was endearing. Mr. Herman, valet to Mr. John Henry Peters, whose extreme views no one could listen to passively, but whose distinctive belly laugh and Yorkshire charm made him impossible to dislike. I could go on. There existed, in those days a true camaraderie in our profession, whatever the small differences in our approach. We were all essentially cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Not the way it is today, when on the rare occasion an employee accompanies a guest here, he is likely to be some newcomer who has little to say about anything other than association football, and who prefers to pass the evening not by the fire of the servants' hall but drinking at the Ploughman's Arms, or indeed, as it seems increasingly likely nowadays, at the Star Inn. I mentioned a moment ago Mr. Graham, the valet butler to Sir James Chambers. In fact, some 2 months ago, I was most happy to learn Sir James was to visit Darlington Hall. I looked forward to the visit not only because visitors from Lord Darlington's days are most rare now, Mr. Faraday's circle naturally being quite different from his lordship's, but also, I presume Mr. Graham would accompany Sir James as of old, and I would thus be able to get his opinion on this question of bantering. I was then both surprised and disappointed to discover a day before the visit that Sir James would be coming alone. Furthermore, during Sir James's subsequent stay, I gathered that Mr. Graham was no longer in Sir James's employ, indeed that Sir James no longer employed any full-time staff at all. I would like to have discovered what had become of Mr. Graham, for although we had not known each other very well, I would say we had got on those occasions we had met. As it was, however, no suitable opportunity arose for me to gain such information. I must say, I was rather disappointed, for I would like to have discussed the bantering question with him. However, let me return to my original thread. I was obliged, as I was saying, to spend some uncomfortable minutes standing in that drawing room yesterday while Mr. Faraday went about his bantering. I responded, as usual, by smiling slightly, sufficient at least to indicate that I was participating in some way with the good-humoredness with which he was carrying on, and waited to see if my employer's permission regarding the trip would be forthcoming. As I had anticipated, he gave his kind permission after not too great a delay, and furthermore, Mr. Faraday was good enough to remember and reiterate his generous offer to foot the bill for the gas. So then, there seems little reason why I should not undertake any more trip to the West Country. I would of course have to write to Miss Kenton to tell her I might be passing by. I would also need to see to the matter of the costumes, various other questions concerning arrangements here in the house during my absence will need to be settled, but all in all I can see no genuine reason why I should not undertake this trip.
前節。
ここまでは前節でした。プローローグでしたね。ここからが話が始まる。Day 1, evening, Salisbury. Tonight, I find myself here in a guest house in the city of Salisbury. The first day of my trip is now complete, and all in all, I must say I am quite satisfied. This expedition began this morning, almost an hour later than I had planned, despite my having completed my packing and loaded the Ford with all necessary items well before 8 o'clock. What with Mrs. Clements and the girls also gone for the week, I suppose I was very conscious of the fact that once I departed, Darlington Hall would stand empty for probably the first time in this century, perhaps for the first time since the day was built. It was an odd feeling, and perhaps accounts for why I delayed my departure so long, wandering around the house many times over, checking one last time that all was in order. It's hard to explain my feelings once I did finally set off. For the first 20 minutes or so of motoring, I cannot say I was seized by any excitement or anticipation at all. This was due, no doubt, to the fact that though I motored further and further from the house, I continued to find myself in surroundings with which I had at least a passing acquaintance. Now I had always supposed I had traveled very little, restricted as I am by my responsibilities in the house. But of course, over time, one does make various excursions for one professional reason or another, and it would seem I have become much more acquainted with those neighboring districts than I had realized. Or as I say, as I motored on in the sunshine towards the Berkshire border, I continued to be surprised with the familiarity of the country around me. But then eventually the surroundings grew unrecognizable, and I knew I had gone beyond all previous boundaries. I have heard people describe the moment when setting sail in a ship, when one finally loses sight of the land. I imagine the experience of unease mixed with exhilaration, often described in connection with this moment, is very similar to what I felt at the ford as the surroundings grew strange around me. This occurred just after I took a turn and found myself on a road curving around the edge of a hill. I could sense the steep drop to my left, though I could not see it due to the trees and thick foliage that lined the roadside. The feeling swept over me that I had truly left Darlington Hall behind, and I must confess I did feel a slight sense of alarm, a sense aggravated by the feeling that I was perhaps not on the correct road at all, but speeding off in totally the wrong direction into a wilderness. It was only the feelings of a moment, but it caused me to slow down, and even when I had assured myself I was on the right road, I felt compelled to stop the car a moment to take stock, as it were. I decided to step out and stretch my legs a little, and when I did so, I received a stronger impression than ever of being perched on the side of a hill. On one side of the road, thickets and small trees rose steeply, while on the other I could now glimpse through the foliage the distant countryside. I believe I had walked a little way along the roadside, peering through the foliage, hoping to get a better view, when I heard a voice behind me. Until this point, of course, I had believed myself quite alone, and I turned in some surprise. A little further up the road on the opposite side, I could see the start of a footpath, which disappeared steeply into the thickets. Sitting on a large stone that marked this spot was a thin, white-haired man in a cloth cap, smoking his pipe. He called to me again, and though I could not quite make out his word, I could see him gesturing for me to join him. For a moment, I took him for a vagrant, but then I saw he was just some local fellow enjoying the fresh air and summer sunshine, and saw no reason not to comply. "Just wondered, sir," he said as I approached, "how fit your legs were." "I beg your pardon." The fellow gestured up the footpath. "You got to have a good pair of legs and a good pair of lungs to go up there. Me, I haven't got neither, so I stay down here. But if I was in better shape, I'd be sitting up there. There's a nice little spot up there, bench and everything, and you wouldn't get a better view anywhere in the whole of England." "If what you say is true," I said, "I think I'd rather stay here. I happen to be embarking on a motoring trip during the course of which I hope to see many splendid views. To see the best before I have properly begun would be somewhat premature." The fellow did not seem to understand me, for he simply said again, "You won't see a better view in the whole of England, but I tell you, you need a good pair of legs and a good pair of lungs." Then he added, "I can see you're in good shape for your age, sir. I'd say you could make your way up there, no trouble. I mean, even I can manage on a good day." I glanced up the path, which did look steep and rather rough. "I'm telling you, sir, you'll be sore if you don't take a walk up there. You never know, a couple more years and it might be too late." He gave a rather vulgar laugh. "Better go on up while you still can." It occurs to me now that the man might just possibly have meant this in a humorous sort of way. That is to say, he intended as a bantering remark, but this morning, I must say, I found it quite offensive. It may well have been the urge to demonstrate just how foolish his insinuation had been that caused me to set off up the footpath. In any case, I'm very glad I did so. Certainly it was a strenuous walk, though I can't say it failed to cause me any real difficulty. Path rising in zigzags up the hillside for 100 yards or so. I then reached a small clearing, undoubtedly the spot the man had referred to. Here one was met by a bench, and indeed by a most marvelous view over miles of the surrounding countryside. What I saw was principally field upon field rolling off into the far distance. The land rose and fell gently, and the fields were bordered by hedges and trees. There were dots in some of the distant fields which I assumed to be sheep. To my right, almost on the horizon, I thought I could see the square tower of a church. It was a fine feeling indeed to be standing up there like that, with the sound of summer all around one, and a light breeze on one's face, and I believe it was then, looking on that view, that I began for the first time to adopt a frame of mind appropriate for the journey before me. For it was then that I felt the first healthy flush of anticipation for the many interesting experiences I know these days ahead hold in store for me. And indeed, it was then that I felt a new resolve not to be daunted in respect to the one professional task I have entrusted myself with. That is to say, regarding Miss Kenton and our present staffing problems. But that was this morning. This evening, I find myself settled here in this comfortable guest house, in a street not far, the centre of Salisbury it is. I suppose a relatively modest establishment, but very clean and perfectly adequate for my needs. The landlady, a woman of around 40 or so, appears to regard me as a rather grand visitor on account of Mr. Faraday's form and the high quality of my suit. This afternoon, I arrived in Salisbury at around 3:30. When I entered my address in her register as Darlington Hall, I could see her look at me with some trepidation, assuming no doubt that I was some gentleman used to such places as the Ritz or the Dorchester, and that I would storm out of her guest house on being shown my room. She informed me that a double room at the front was available, though I was welcome to it for the price of a single. I was then brought up to this room, in which, at the point of the day, the sun was lighting up the floral patterns on the wall quite agreeably. There were twin beds and a pair of good-sized windows overlooking the street. On inquiring where the bathroom was, the woman told me in a timid voice that although it was the door facing mine, there would be no hot water available until after supper. I asked her to bring me up a pot of tea, and when she had gone, inspected the room further. The beds were perfectly clean and had been well made. The basin in the corner was also very clean. On looking out of the window, one saw on the opposite side of the street a bakery displaying a variety of pastries, a chemist's shop, and a barber's further along. One could see where the street passed over round-backed bridge and on into more rural surroundings. I refreshed my face and hands with the cold water at the basin, and seated myself on a hard-backed chair left near one of the windows to wait my tea. I would suppose it would be shortly after 4 o'clock that I left the guest house and ventured out into the streets of Salisbury. The wide, airy nature of the streets here gave the city a marvelously spacious feel, so that I found it most easy to spend some hours just strolling in the gently warm sunshine. Moreover, I discovered the city to be one of the many charms. Time and again, I found myself wandering just past delightful rows of old timber-fronted houses, or crossing some little stone footbridge over one of the many streams that flow through the city. And of course, I did not fail to visit the fine cathedral, much praised by Mrs. Simmons in her volume. This August building was hardly difficult for me to locate, its looming spire being ever visible whenever one goes in Salisbury. Indeed, as I was making my way back to this guest house this evening, I glanced back over my shoulder. On a number of occasions I was met each time by a view of the sun setting behind that great spire. And yet tonight, in the quiet of this room, I find that what really remains of me from this first day's travel is not Salisbury Cathedral, nor any of the other charming sights of the city, but rather the marvelous view encountered this morning of the rolling English countryside. Now I am quite prepared to believe that other countries can offer more obviously spectacular scenes. Indeed, I have seen in encyclopedias and the National Geographic magazine breathtaking photographs of sights from various corners of the globe, magnificent canyons and waterfalls, raggedly beautiful mountains. It has never, of course, been my privilege to have seen such things at first hand, but I will nevertheless hazard this with some confidence. The English landscape at its finest, such as I saw this morning, possessed a quality that the landscapes of other nations, however more superficially dramatic, inevitably fail to possess. It is, I believe, a quality that will mark out the English landscape to any objective observer as the most deeply satisfying in the world, and this quality is probably best summed up by the term greatness, for it is true, when I stood on that high ledge this morning and viewed the land before me, I distinctly felt that rare yet unmistakable feeling, the feeling that one is in the presence of greatness. We call this land of ours Great Britain, and that there may be those who believe this is somewhat a modest practice, yet I would venture that the landscape of our country alone would justify the use of this lofty adjective. And yet, what precisely is this greatness? Just where or in what does it lie? I am quite aware that it would take a far wiser head than mine to answer such a question. But if I were forced to hazard a guess, I would say that it is the very lack of obvious drama or spectacle that sets the beauty of our land apart. What is pertinent is the calmness of that beauty and its sense of restraint. It is though the land knows of its own beauty, of its own greatness. It is as though the land knows of its own beauty, of its own greatness, and feels no need to shout it. In comparison, the sort of sights offered in places as Africa and America, though undoubtedly very exciting, would sure strike the objective ear as inferior on account of their unseemly demonstrativeness. This whole question is very akin to the question that has caused much debate in our profession over the years. What is a great butler? I can recall many hours of enjoyable discussion on this topic around the fire of the servants' hall at the end of a day. You will notice I say what rather than who is a great butler, for there was actually no serious dispute as to the identity of the men who set the standards amongst our generation. That is to say, I am talking of the likes of Mr. Marshall, Trelwell House, or Mr. Lane of Brightwood. If you have ever had the privilege of meeting such men, you will no doubt know of the quality they possess to which I refer. But you will no doubt also understand what I mean when I say it is not at all easy to define just what this quality is. Incidentally, now that I come to think further about it, it is not quite true to say that there was no dispute as to who were the great butlers, but what I should have said was that there was no serious dispute among professionals of quality who had any discernment in such matters, of course. The servants' hall at Darlington Hall, like any servants' hall anywhere, was obliged to receive employees of varying degrees of intellect and perception, and I recall many a time having to bite my lip while some employee, and I sometimes regret to say members of my own staff, excitedly eulogized the likes of, say, Mr. Jack Neighbors. I have nothing against Mr. Jack Neighbors, who sadly, as I said, was killed in the war. I mention him simply because his was a typical case. For 2 or 3 years in the mid-30s, Mr. Neighbors' names seemed to dominate conversations in every servants' hall in the land. As I say, at Darlington Hall too, many a visiting employee would bring the late tales of Mr. Neighbors' achievements, so that I and the likes of Mr. Graham would have to share the frustrating experience of hearing anecdote after anecdote relating to him. And most frustrating of all would be having to witness the conclusion of each such anecdote. Otherwise, decent employees shaking their heads and wondering under faces like that Mr. Neighbors, he really is the best. Now, I do not doubt that Mr. Neighbors had good organizational skills. He did, I understand, mastermind a number of large occasions with conspicuous style, but at no stage did he ever approach the status of great butler. I could have told you this at the height of his reputation, since I could have predicted his downfall after a few short years in the limelight. How often have you known for the butler who is on everyone's lips one day as the created of assertion to be proved demonstrably within a few years to have been nothing of the sort, and yet those very same employees who once heaped praise on him will be too busy eulogizing some new figure to stop and examine their sense of judgment. The object of this sort of servants' hall talk is invariably some butler who has come to the fore quite suddenly, who having been appointed by a prominent house, and who has perhaps managed to pull off 2 or 3 large occasions with some success. There will then be all sorts of rumors buzzing through servants' halls up and down the country, to the effect that he has been approached by this or that personage, or that several of the highest houses are competing for his services with wildly high wages. And what has happened before a few years have passed? The same invincible figure has been held responsible for some blunder, or has, for some other reason, fallen out of favor with his employers, leaves the house where he came to fame and is never heard of again. Meanwhile, those same gossipers will have found yet some other newcomer about whom to enthuse. Visiting valets, I have found, are often the worst offenders, aspiring as they usually do to the position of butler with some urgency. They it is who tend to be always insisting that this or that figure is the one to emulate, or repeating what some particular hero is said to have pronounced upon professional matters. But then, of course, I hasten to add, there are many valets who would never dream of indulging in this sort of folly. Who are, in fact, professionals of the highest discernment. And 2 or 3 such persons were gathered together at our servants' hall. I mean of the caliber of, say, Mr. Graham, with whom now, sadly, I seem to have lost touch. We would have some of the most stimulating and intelligent debates on the aspect of our vocation. Indeed, today, those evenings ran amongst my fondest memories from those times. But let me return to the question that is of genuine interest. This question we so enjoyed debating when our evenings were not spoiled by chatter from those who lacked any fundamental understanding of the profession. That is to say, the question, what is a great butler? To the best of my knowledge, for all the talk this question has engendered over the years, there have been very few attempts within the profession to formulate an official answer. The only instance that comes to mind is the attempt of the Hayes Society to devise criteria for membership. You may not be aware of the Hayes Society, for few talk of it these days, but in the 20s and the early 30s, it exerted a considerable influence over much of London and the House Counties. In fact, many felt its power had become too great and thought it no bad thing when it was forced to close. I believe in 1932 or 1933. The Hayes Society claimed to admit butlers of only the very first rank. Much of the power and prestige it went on to gain derived from the fact that, like other such organizations which have come and gone, it managed to keep its numbers extremely low, thus giving claims some credibility. Membership was said never at any point rose above 30, and much of the time remained closer to 9-10. This and the fact that The Hay Society tended to be a rather secretive body, lent it much mystique for a time, ensuring that the pronouncements it occasionally issued on professional matters were received as though hewn on tablets of stone. For one matter the society resisted pronouncing on for some time was the question of its own criteria for membership. We're sure to have these announced steadily mounted in response to a series of letters published in A Quarterly for the Gentleman's Gentleman. The society admitted that prerequisite for membership was that an applicant be attached to a distinguished household, though of course the society went on, this by itself is far from sufficient to satisfy requirements. It was made clear furthermore that the society did not regard the houses of businessmen or the newly rich as distinguished, and in my opinion this piece of outdated thinking crucially undermined any serious authority. The society may have achieved arbitrate on standards in our profession. In response to further letters in A Quarterly, the society justified its stance by saying that while it accepted some correspondents' views that certain butlers of excellent quality were to be found in the houses of businessmen, the assumption had to be that the houses of true ladies and gentlemen would not refrain long from acquiring the services of any such person. One had to be guided by the judgment of the true ladies and gentlemen, argued the society, or else we may as well adapt the properties of Bolshevik Russia. This provoked further controversy, and the pressure of letters continued to build up, urging the society to declare more fully its membership criteria. In the end, it was revealed in a brief letter to A Quarterly that in the view of the society, and I will try and quote accurately from memory, the most crucial criterion is that the applicant be possessed of a dignity in keeping with his profession. No applicant will satisfy requirements, whatever his level of accomplishment otherwise, if seen to fall short in this respect. For all my lack of enthusiasm for the Hay Society, it is in my belief that this particular pronouncement at least was founded on a significant truth. If one looks at these persons we agree are great butlers, if one looks at, say, Mr. Marshall or Mr. Lane, it does seem to me that the factor which distinguishes them from those butlers who are merely extremely competent is most closely captured by this word dignity. Of course, this merely begs the further question of what is dignity comprised of. And it was on this point that the likes of Mr. Graham and I had some of our most interesting debates. Mr. Graham would always take the view that this dignity was something like a woman's beauty, and it was thus pointless to attempt to analyze it. I, on the other hand, held the opinion that to draw such a parallel tended to demean the dignity of the likes of Mr. Marshall. Moreover, my main objection to Mr. Graham's analogy was the implication that this dignity was something one possessed or did not by a fluke of nature. And if one did not self-evidently have it, to strive after it would be as futile as an elderly woman trying to make herself beautiful. Now, while I would accept that the majority of butlers may well discover ultimately that they do not have the capacity for it, I believe strongly that this dignity is something one can meaningfully strive for throughout one's career. Those great butlers like Mr. Marshall, who have, I am sure, acquired over many years of self-training and the careful absorbing of experience. In my view, then, it was rather defeatist from a vocational standpoint to adopt a stance like Mr. Graham's. In any case, for all Mr. Graham's skepticism, I can remember he and I spending many evenings trying to put our fingers on the constitution of his dignity. We never came to an agreement, but I can say for my part that I developed fairly firm ideas of my own on the matter during the course of such discussions, and they are by and large the beliefs I still hold today. I would like, if I may, to try and say here what I think this dignity to be. You will not dispute, I presume, that Mr. Marshall and Charleville House and Mr. Lane of Ridewood have been the two great butlers of recent times. Perhaps you might be persuaded that Mr. Henderson of Bramber Castle also falls into this rare category, but you may think me merely biased if I say that my own father, would in many ways be considered to rank with such men, and that his career is the one I have always scrutinized for definition of dignity. Yet it is my firm conviction that at the peak of his career at Loughborough House, my father was indeed the embodiment of dignity. I realize that if one looks at the matter objectively, one has to concede my father lacked various attributes one may normally expect in a great butler. Those same absent attributes, I would argue, are every time those of a superficial and decorative order. Attributes that are attractive, no doubt, as icing on the cake, but are not pertaining to what is really essential. I refer to such things as good accent and command of language, general knowledge on wide range of topics such as falconing or newt mating, attributes none of which my father could have boasted. Furthermore, it must be remembered that my father, the butler of an earlier generation, who began his career at a time when such attributes were not considered proper, let alone desirable in a butler. The obsession with eloquence and general knowledge would appear to be ones that emerged with our generation, probably in the wake of Mr. Marshall, when lessermen trying to emulate his great mistook the superficial for the essence. It is my view that our generation has been much too preoccupied with the trimmings. Goodness knows how much time and energy has gone into practicing of accent and command of language, how many hours spent studying encyclopedias, volumes of test your knowledge, when the time should have been spent mastering the basic fundamentals. Though we must be careful not to attempt to deny the responsibility which ultimately lies with ourselves, it has to be said that certain employers have done much to encourage these sorts of trends. I'm sorry to say this, but there would appear to have been a number of houses in recent times, some of which of the highest pedigree, which have tended to take a competitive attitude towards each other and have not been above showing off to guests or butlers' mastery of such trivial accomplishments. I've heard of various instances of a butler being displayed as a kind of performing monkey at a house party. In one regrettable case, which I myself witnessed, it had become an established sport in the house for guests to ring for the butler and put to him random questions of the order of, say, who had won the Derby in such and such a year, or rather, as one might remember a man at the music hall. My father, as I say, came of a generation mercifully free of such confusions of our professional values, and I will maintain that for all his limited command of English and his limited general knowledge, he not only knew all there was to know about how to run a house, he did in his prime come to acquire that dignity, keeping with his profession. As the haste of society puts it, if I try then to describe to you what I believe made my father thus distinguished, it may in this way convey my idea of what dignity is. There was a certain story my father was fond of repeating over the years. I recall listening to him tell it to visitors when I was a child, and then later when I was starting out as a footman under his supervision. I remember him relating it again the first time I returned to see him, after gaining my first post as butler, to Mr. and Mrs. Muggeridge, in their relatively modest house in Alshot, Oxfordshire. Clearly the moment meant much to him. My father's generation was not accustomed to discussing and analyzing the ways ours is, and I believe the telling and retelling of this story was as close as my father ever came to reflecting critically on the profession he practiced. As such, it gives a vital clue to his thinking. The story was an apparently true one concerning a certain butler who had travelled with his employer to India and served there for many years, maintaining amongst the native staff the same high standards he had commanded in England. One afternoon, evidently this butler entered the dining room to make sure all was well for dinner, when he noticed a tiger languishing beneath the dining table. The butler had left the dining room quietly, taking care to close the doors behind him. He proceeded calmly to the drawing room where his employer was taking tea with a number of visitors. Then he attracted his employer's attention with a polite cough, and then whispered in the latter's ear, "I'm very sorry, sir, but there appears to be a tiger in the dining room. Perhaps you will permit the 12 oars to be used?" And according to legend, a few minutes later, the employer and his guest heard 3 gunshots, and the butler reappeared in the drawing room with some time afterwards to refresh the teapots. The employer had inquired if all was well. "Perfectly fine, thank you, sir," came the reply. "Dinner will be served at the usual time, and I am pleased to say there will be no discernible traces left of the recent occurrence by that time." This last phrase, "no discernible traces left of the recent occurrence by that time," my father would repeat with a laugh and shake his head. He neither claimed to know the butler's name, nor anyone who had known him, but he would always insist he was up, shut up. In any case, but he will also say that it had occurred just as he told it. In any case, it is of little importance whether or not the story is true. The significant thing is, however, what it reveals concerning father's ideals. For when I look back over his career, I can see, with hindsight, that he must have striven throughout years somehow to become that butler of a story. And in my view, at the peak of his career, my father achieved his ambition. For although I am sure he never had the chance to encounter a tiger beneath the dining table, when I think over all I know or have heard concerning him, I can think of at least several instances of his displaying in abundance that very quality he so admired in the butler of his story. One such instance was related to me by Mr. David Charles, of the Charles and Reading Company, who visited Darlington Hall from time to time during Lord Darlington's days. It was one evening when I happened to be valeting him. Mr. Charles told me he had come across my father some years earlier with a guest at Lowborough House, the home of Mr. John Silvers, the industrialist where my father served for 15 years at the height of his career. He had never been quite able to forget my father, Mr. Charles told me, owing to an incident that occurred during that visit. One afternoon, Mr. Charles, to his shame and regret, had allowed himself to become inebriated in the company of 2 fellow guests. Gentlemen, I shall merely recall Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, since they are likely to be still remembered in certain circles. After an hour or so of drinking, these 2 gentlemen decided they wished to go for an afternoon drive around the local villages, motor car this time still being something of a novelty. They persuaded Mr. Charles to accompany them, and since the chauffeur was on leave at this point, enlisted my father to drive the car. Once they had set off, Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones, for all their being well into their middle years, proceeded to behave like schoolboys, singing coarse songs and making even coarse comments on all they saw from the window. Furthermore, these gentlemen had noticed on the local map 3 villages in the vicinity called Morphy, Saltash, and Brigoon. Now I'm not entirely sure these were the exact names, but the point was there went Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones of the music hall act, Murphy, Saltman, and Bridget the cat, of which you may have heard, on noticing this curious coincidence. The gentleman then gained an ambition to visit the 3 villages in question, in honor, as it were, of the music hall artists. Or according to Mr. Charles, my father had duly driven to one village and was on the point of entering a second when Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones noticed the village was Brigoon, that is to say, the 3rd, not the 2nd, name of the sequence. They demanded angrily that my father turn the car immediately so that the villages could be visited in the correct order. It so happened that this entailed doubling back a considerable way of the route, but so, Charles assured me, my father accepted the request as though it were a perfectly reasonable one, and in general continued to behave with immaculate courtesy. But Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones' attention had now been drawn to my father, and no doubt either bored with what the view outside had to offer. They proceeded to amuse themselves by shouting out unflattering remarks concerning my father's mistake. Mr. Charles remembered marveling at how my father showed not one hint of discomfort or anger, continued to drive with an expression balanced perfectly between personal dignity and readiness to oblige. My father's equanimity was not, however, allowed to last, for when they had wearied of hurling insults at my father's back, the two gentlemen began to discuss their host, that is to say, my father's employer, Mr. John Silvers. The remarks grew ever more debased and treacherous, so that Mr. Charles, at least so he claimed, was obliged to intervene with the suggestion that such talk was bad form. This view was contradicted with such energy that Mr. Charles, quite aside from worrying he would become the next focus of the gentleman's attention, actually thought himself in danger of physical assault. Then suddenly, following a particularly heinous insinuation against his employer, my father brought the car to an abrupt halt. It was what happened next that had made such an indelible impression on Mr. Charles. The rear door of the car opened, and my father was observed to be standing there, a few steps back from the vehicle, gazing steadily into the interior. As Mr. Charles described, all three passengers seemed to be overcome as one by the realization of what an imposing physical force my father was. Indeed, he was a man of some 6 feet 3 inches, and his countenance, though reassuring, well, one knew he was intent on obliging, would seem extremely forbidding, viewed in certain other contexts. According to Mr. Charles, my father did not display any obvious anger. He had, it seemed, merely opened the door, and yet there was something so powerfully rebuking, and at the same time so unassailable about his figure looming over them, that Mr. Charles' true delicate companions seemed to cower back like small boys caught by the farmer in the act of stealing apples. My father had proceeded to stand there for some moments, saying nothing, merely holding open the door. Eventually, either Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones had remarked, "Are we not going on with the journey?" My father did not reply, but continued to stand there silently, neither demanding disembarkation nor offering any clue as to his desires or intentions. I can well imagine how he must have looked that day, framed by the doorway of the vehicle, his dark, severe presence, quite blotting out the effect of the gentle Hertfordshire scenery behind him. Those were Mr. Charles recalled strangely unnerving moments during which he too, despite not having participated in the preceding behavior, felt engulfed with guilt. The silence seemed to go on interminably before either Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones found it in him. I suppose we were talking a little out of turn. It won't happen again. 広告入りますね。少々お待ちください。
喉しっかり休めてね。
Tadaima. I suppose we were talking a little out of turn there. It won't happen again. A moment to consider this, then my father had closed the door. Gently, turned to the wheel and proceeded to continue the tour of the three villages. A tour Mr. Charles assured me that was completed thereafter in near silence. Now that I have recalled this episode, another event from around that time in my father's career comes to mind, which demonstrates, perhaps even more impressively, the special quality he came to possess. I should explain here that I am one of two brothers, and that my elder brother, Leonard, was killed during the Southern African War, while I was still a boy. Naturally, my father would have felt this loss keenly, but to make matters worse, the usual comfort a father has in these situations, that is, the notion that his son gave his life gloriously for king and country, was stilled by the fact that my brother had perished in a particularly infamous maneuver. Not only was alleged that the maneuver had been a most un-British attack on civilian Boer settlements, overwhelmingly evidence emerged that it had been irresponsibly commanded with several floutings of elementary military precautions, so that the men who had died, my brother among them, had died quite needlessly. In view of what I am about to relate, it would not be proper of me to identify the maneuver any more precisely. Though you may well guess which one I am alluding to, if I say that it caused something of an uproar at the time, adding significantly to the controversy the conflict as a whole was attracting. There had been cause for the removal, even the court-martialing of the general concerned. But the army had defended the latter, and he had been allowed to complete the campaign. What is less known is that at the close of the Southern African conflict, the same general had been discreetly retired, and he had then entered business dealing in shipments from Southern Africa. I relate this because some 10 years after the conflict, that is to say, when the wounds of bereavement had only superficially healed, my father was called into Mr. John Silver's study to be told that this very same personage, I will call him simply the General, was due to visit for a number of days to attend a house party, during which my father's employer hoped to lay the foundations of a lucrative business transaction. Mr. Silvers, however, had remembered the significance the visit would have for my father, and had thus called him in to offer him the option of taking several days' leave for the duration of the general's stay. My father's feelings towards the general were naturally those of utmost loathing, but he realized too that his employer's present business aspirations hung on the smooth running of the house party, which with some 18 or so people expected would be no trifling affair. My father thus replied to the effect that, while he was most grateful that his feelings had been taken into account, Mr. Silvers could be assured that service would be provided to the usual standards. As things turned out, my father's ordeal proved even worse than might have been predicted. For one thing, any host my father may have had that to meet the general in person would arouse a sense of respect or sympathy to leaven his feelings against him. Proved without foundation, the general was a portly, ugly man. His manners were not refined, and his talk was conspicuous for an eagerness to apply military similes to a very wide variety of matters. Worse was to come with the news that the general had brought no valet, his usual man having fallen ill. This presented a delicate problem, another of the house guests being also without his valet, raising the question as to which guest should be allocated the butler as valet and who the footman. My father, appreciating his employer's position, volunteered to take the general, and thus was obliged to suffer intimate proximity for 4 days with the man he detested. Meanwhile, the general, having no idea of my father's feeling, took full opportunity to relate anecdotes of his military accomplishments, as of course many military gentlemen are wont to do to their valets in the privacy of their rooms. Yet so did my father hide his feelings. Yet so well did my father hide his feelings, so professionally did he carry out his duties, that on his departure, the General had actually complimented Mr. John Silvers on the excellence of his butler, and had left an unusually large tip in appreciation, which my father without hesitation asked his employer to donate to a charity. I hope you will agree that in these two instances I have cited from his career, both of which I have had corroborated and believed to be accurate, my father not only manifests but comes close to being the personification itself of what the Hayes Society terms dignity in keeping with his position. If one considers the difference between my father at such moments and a figure such as Mr. Jack Neighbours, even with the best of his technical flourishes, I believe one may begin to distinguish what it is that separates a great butler from a merely competent one. We may now understand better too why my father was so fond of the story of the butler who failed to panic on discovering a tiger under the dining table. It was because he knew instinctively that somewhere in his story lay the kernel of what true dignity is. And let me now point this. Dignity has to do crucially with the butler's ability not to abandon the professional being he inhabits. Lesser butlers will abandon their professional being for the private one, that at the least provocation. For such persons, being a butler is like playing some pantomime role. Small push, a slight stumble, and the facade will drop off to reveal the actor underneath. The great butlers are great by virtue of their ability to inhabit their professional role and inhabit it to the utmost. They will not be shaken out by external events, however surprising, alarming, or vexing. They wear their professionalism as a decent gentleman will wear his suit. He will not let ruffians or circumstances tear it off in the public case. He will discard it when and only when he wills to do so, and his will invariably be when he is entirely alone. It is, as I say, a matter of dignity. It is sometimes said that butlers only truly exist in England. Other countries, whatever title is actually used, have only manservants. I tend to believe this is true. Continentals are unable to be butlers because they are a breed incapable of emotional restraint, which only the English race are capable of. Continentals, and by large the Celts, as you will no doubt agree, are as a rule unable to control themselves in moments of strong emotion, and are thus unable to maintain a professional demeanor other than in the least challenging of situations. If I may return to my early metaphor, you will excuse my putting it so coarsely. They are like a man who will at the slightest provocation tear off his suit and his shirt and run about screaming. In a word, dignity is beyond such persons. We English have an important advantage over foreigners in this respect. It is for this reason that when you think of a great butler, he is bound, almost by definition, to be an Englishman. Of course, you may retort, as did Mr. Graham when I expounded such a line during those enjoyable discussions by the fire, that if I am correct in what I am saying, one could recognize a great butler as such only after one has seen him perform under some severe test, and yet the truth is we accept persons such as Mr. Marshall and Mr. Lane to be great, though most of us cannot claim to have ever scrutinized them under such conditions. I have to admit, Mr. Graham has a point here, but all I can say is that after one has been in the profession as long as one has, one is able to judge intuitively the depth of a man's professionalism, without having to see it under pressure. Indeed, on the occasion one is fortunate enough to meet a great butler, far from experiencing any skeptical urge to demand a test, one is at a loss to imagine any situation which one could ever dislodge a professionalism born with such authority. In fact, I am sure it was in an apprehension of this sort penetrating even the thick haze created by alcohol, which reduced my father's passengers into a shamed silence that Sunday afternoon, many years ago. It is with such men as it is with such the English landscape, seen at its best as I did this morning. When one encounters them, one simply knows one is in the presence of greatness. There will always be, I realize, those who would claim that any attempt to analyze greatness, as I have been doing so, is quite futile. You know when somebody's got it, and you know when somebody hasn't. Mr. Graham's argument would always be, beyond that there's nothing much he can say. But I believe we have a duty not to be so defeatist in this matter. It is surely a professional responsibility for all of us to think deeply about those things, so that each of us may better strive towards attaining dignity for ourselves. 面白い話ですね。今まで自分の名前すら話してないけど、誰のことだか知らないが、スティーブンス、スティーブンス、名前はあった。そう、これ。今日はここまでにしておくね。1日で。チャプターはどう？一つ。チャプター一つでね。そこまでにしておく。お疲れありがとう。次はちょっとだけ翻訳して説明するね。ここまでの話。いや、多分、すみやさんの方がもっとうまくできるかも。でも、頑張ります。それじゃあ、どこか行こうか。トムレイドさんはエルデンにやってます。あそこ行きましょうか。いや、こちらこそ来てくれて、ちゃんと聞いてくれてありがとう。レード開始、そして最後の歌を歌いましょうね。ダメだね、ダメよ、ダメなのよ。あんたが好きで好きすぎて、どれだけ強いお酒でも歪まない思い出がバカみたい。ドンチャンス、みやさん、ピッピさん、3人とも来てくれて、聞いてくれてありがとう。次の本読み配信は日曜日、同じ時間ですね。続きはチャプター2から。それじゃあ、あそこで会いましょう。さよなら。